Welcome back. This video is about deduction. If you're looking to become a clear, critical thinker, some basic knowledge about deduction is invaluable. Deduction helps to understand what people are saying. It helps to organize your research, and you can even start to assess the credibility of other people's arguments on purely logical grounds. But what is it? Deduction is a form of inference or reasoning. You connect premises to conclusions in such a way that the conclusion logically follows. What does that mean? We'll see how it works in a bit. Important to notice two important outcomes of deductions. That is, getting new knowledge or finding additional evidence for a thesis you know is true. Other people might not be convinced yet. We'll look at four basic rules used in deduction, and then especially the ones that will help us to uncover new knowledge. These are called syllogisms, which is Latin, meaning something like reasoning together. Or we can also call them informative deductions. This is getting new information through deduction. The rules of deduction are unique to the different molecular sentences. The implication is by far the most important one, and there are three logically valid ways how you can infer new information from a true implication. Don't be alarmed by the fancy names, this should all make sense in a minute. The disjunction is good for one rule of inference, the disjunctive syllogism. And the good news is you are using these rules all the time, maybe you just don't know their names just yet. So let's explore. Well, hold on a second, you might say. What about the conjunction? Indeed, you can use rules of inference for conjunctions too. They are just not very informative. You don't really learn new things from it. Suppose that you only know two sentences in the whole world to be true. John is walking, John is singing. Do you learn something new if you combine them into a conjunction? Is John is walking and singing new information to you then? It's good to learn the name of this rule of inference, conveniently also called conjunction. The reverse is also true. If you know just one sentence in the world to be true, John is walking and singing, then of course the sentence John is walking is also true. But that's hardly new information. This rule is called simplification, but it's not informative, just like conjunction. We're looking for more powerful logic here that can help us to actually increase our knowledge. So, onwards to syllogisms, logic that can give us new information. First rule of deduction has a fancy name, affirming the antecedent. Suppose that the following is the case. The implication, if my house is on fire, it is damaged, is a true implication. I think we can all agree that it's so. But this in itself says nothing about our actual house. We need a second premise, one that we can know from observation. My house is on fire. Just imagine that it's true. From these two premises, you can infer a third premise that must also be true. What is the conclusion that follows? Right, my house is damaged. This premise is different from the first two, so we've actually learned something new here. We started out knowing only the truth of two premises, and through deductive reasoning, we learned a third. You might say this is rather unspectacular, but this is one of the underpinnings of our everyday lives and used in every exchange of ideas. Without this basic rule of logic, we could not learn anything at all. And now you know what it's called. And similarly, the next rule of inference also deals with the implication, except now we won't say something about the antecedent, but about the consequent. If the consequent of a true implication is false, then it follows logically that the antecedent is also false. So if we keep the same implication and deny the consequent, what would be the conclusion? Hope that you got it. The house is not on fire. That's the third premise that follows logically if the other two are true. Check out this house that survived a major forest fire. The grounds around the house are scorched, but the house itself is secure and undamaged. That would have been different if the fire had gotten hold of the house. The third and last valid inference that can be drawn from the implication is the hypothetical syllogism. That means we don't learn something about the real world, but just something that is possible. A hypothetical is something that you expect to happen, not something that actually already happened. Hypothetical syllogism combines two implications if the consequent of the first matches the antecedent of the second. What would the conclusion be? Obviously, repairs are needed after the fire to fix the damage. We combine two implications in one new implication. That's a new statement, of which we just learned the truth through deduction, and therefore this inference is informative. And it's quite plausibly true. Check out what happened to the Notre Dame in Paris after a fire destroyed a part of it. The repair guys came up and they started to repair it. When there is good reasoning, there is also bad reasoning. There are three ways you can draw an informative conclusion from an implication. But there are also two mistakes you can make. That in itself is enough reason to study logic, not because valid inferences are somehow hard, but because mistakes are just as easy to make. Make sure you familiarize yourself with the abbreviations of the rules of inference. It's enough to mention those two letters if you're asked which logical rule was used. About the mistakes. If you deny the antecedent as opposed to affirming it, you cannot draw a valid conclusion. The same goes for the consequent. Denying it is valid, affirming it means you made a mistake. Let's see two illustrations. Two premises, one conclusion. However, because we fallaciously denied the antecedent here, our conclusion is that this muffled dog is no dog at all. Poor thing. And a fallacy is just a fancy word for mistaken reasoning. Here we affirm the consequent. Both premises could very well be true, but the conclusion could still be false. If a person is ill, it doesn't follow that there's always a fever. That means a fallacious inference was made here. That's it for the implication. Three valid inferences, two fallacious ones. Those are all the possibilities. Once you know them all, you're a master of implications. The disjunction is easier. We use the strong interpretation here of the disjunction, in which one and not both of the disjuncts can be true. That is the most common everyday use of the disjunction. The premises here, suppose they are true. A baby can be a boy or a girl, and it's not a girl, the baby is a boy. So through deduction, we learned the truth of a statement that was not part of our premises. So it was an informative deduction. We learned something new. But what if the baby was a girl? Then it's not a boy. So disjunctions are a bit easier to understand than implications, and also less common. So the implication is very important to understand. The disjunction, slightly less important, but still handy to recognize. It is used a lot to present people with false dilemmas, which you can bust using your logic skills. To train yourself in logic, it's good to not get distracted by the premises. Instead of the logic of the argument, you might find yourself moving too fast and assessing the truth of the premises. That comes only after you establish the validity of the inference. We replace the antecedent and consequent, or the disjuncts and conjuncts of molecular sentences, with just one letter, usually P and Q, and onwards to Z from there. This is so your maximum focus is on finding bad inference, and you're doing just one thing at a time. Here are the valid inferences from the implication again, only in symbols as opposed to full sentences. If P is true, then Q is true. We say that P is true, therefore Q must also be true. And that is affirming the antecedent. If P is true, then Q is true, and Q is not true, then P is also not true. That is denying the consequent. So here we have hypothetical syllogism. If P is true, then Q is true. If Q is true, then R is true. That leads us to the conclusion that if P is true, then R is true. And this is a valid inference because of hypothetical syllogism. Alright, it's time to do some practicing for yourself to see if you understood the logic and can apply it. You won't get better at this until you start to work it for yourself. Alright, good luck. See you next time.